Okay, so I want to present just two studies to you today, hopefully not too many, and it's collaborative work with these four colleagues, and as you can see, they're not all psychologists because one of the projects is very much an interdisciplinary project. So two projects. One is going to look at immigrant children in Chile, and their well-being, the drivers of their well-being, and the other is going to look at resettled refugees in the UK. And again, the main focus will be on their well-being. So the common themes are, as I've just said, well-being. The main independent variable is going to be intergroup contact or the desire for contact, and the two are quite closely connected. They're both situated broadly within the acculturation and intergroup contact traditions, and they're both going to use the same kind of research design, which is a longitudinal three-wave panel design. They both, in fact, also used mixed methods approaches, although I'll only present to you today the quantitative data, although there is one nice quote at the end, which will just hopefully illuminate the point of the main point of the second study. So, I want to start with acculturation and well-being, and as you will know, John Berry, for many years, has proposed a two-dimensional framework in which he suggests that immigrants are faced with two challenges, or two questions. How much contact do they want to have with the majority culture, and how much do they wish to maintain their heritage culture? We use shorthand here, DC and CM. And although he's commonly misrepresented in this, but he's often thought of saying, well, the optimal acculturation orientation for well-being is the so-called integration option, that is where you're high on both dimensions. He does say this, but he is also careful to qualify it, that in some circumstances, actually, integration may not be the optimal outcome or the optimal orientation. But anyway, that's a common prediction, and I certainly share that in many circumstances. However, there are just two or three points to make about that. He himself, in his very big cross-national study that he published in 2006 with a number of colleagues, he actually provides some data himself, which suggests that in some circumstances, both separation and assimilation are positively related to well-being. And sometimes the effects there are as big, if not bigger, than for integration. And Gulseli-Besu also did some very interesting work in Belgium to show that in some circumstances, particularly where you're in a high discrimination context, their integration may not always serve you well. Second observation about the acculturation field, I've been banging on about this for a year or two. There's very little longitudinal evidence. Not surprisingly, it's quite hard to do longitudinal research, especially with hard-to-reach immigrant samples. But of course, without longitudinal data, inferences of causality are a bit ambiguous. We published something ourselves a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, where we did actually provide some longitudinal evidence, which was supportive of the integration hypothesis, although we came up with one circumstance in which integration seemed to have adverse consequences. And the other observation, most of the acculturation field, like the rest of social psychology, has focused on adults, often students, and very little work has been done on immigrant children. And obviously, immigrant children are faced with acculturation challenges just like their parents. So that's acculturation. What about intergroup contact? Well, we all know that intergroup contact is positively related to intergroup attitudes, favorable intergroup attitudes, and we have Linda here who published that famous meta-analysis with Tom Pettigrew. So that's a well-established finding. What I got interested in a few years back was whether or not we could also show that it had other positive outcomes, particularly well-being outcomes for the minority groups who may be having contact with the majority. Well, why might that be? Well, I want to say a little bit, first of all, about language, because language, host language or majority language competence itself is associated with many well-being measures. It it gives you a greater sense of self-efficacy. It'll allow you to participate in the labor market. It'll open doors in the education field as well. So there are many reasons to think that language will be associated with well-being. And of course, if you've got some competence in the majority language, you're more likely to be able to have good contact. So right there, there's a possible causal connection with language in there in the mix. We don't know, though, whether competence in the majority language leads to more contact or vice versa. It could be that the more contact, the more majority members you know, the better your language. Could be both. And then there's a second line of argument here, which I think is unexplored in the field. It could just be that those other positive outcomes from contact, the attitudinal outcomes, actually feed into well-being as well. If you have better relationships with majority members, you'll get positive feedback from that, your social support and all those things, and those outcomes will be beneficial perhaps for your own well-being. So we're going to look at that hypothesis, particularly in connection with refugee well-being. So for my first study, and this is, I want to acknowledge the fantastic work of Cecilia Cordeaux, who just finished her PhD with me. She's now back in Chile, not quite with Roberto, but I'm sure she'd be very happy if Roberto could find her a job. Some of you may know a little bit about Chile. Chile is one of the kind of economic success stories of Latin America, and partly as a consequence of that, it's been a very attractive destination for migrants. I think last time I looked at some data, over 350,000, some 2% of the population. And these migrants come from all over, but particularly from sort of their neighbors, Peru, Argentina, and Bolivia. So Cecilia was very interested in this phenomenon. Being an immigrant herself, she was originally of Argentinian extraction. Her husband is from Peru, so they had a kind of family reason for being interested in the well-being of immigrant children. So she managed to get a hold of a sample, 200-odd, spanning the age from elementary through to secondary school, so the mean age of about 11 and a half years, roughly equal numbers of boys and girls. And it was... you can see they're all first-generation immigrants with between 1 and 5 years time of residence in the country. So she conducted this three-wave longitudinal study over a 10-month period. The attrition from time 1 to time 3 is actually not bad. She only lost 17%, although she's actually got complete data from somewhat fewer than that. But as you see, 150 children, so we can track these 150 children over 3 time points over this 10-month period. The measures are fairly conventional measures adapted for use with children, so desire for contact, you can see, and the way we present this is we present little pictures to the kids and we say, okay, here's some children like you, what do you think? Is it important for these children to be friends with others whose families have always lived in Chile? It's good for these children to play with others whose families have always lived in Chile, and so on. So that's desire for contact. And then we have similar idea to tap into the culture maintenance idea, and this is to ask questions about it's important to maintain the traditions of where you come from, the festivals, the religion, the typical language, and so on. And we had a number of well-being items, but the one I want to focus on today is life satisfaction. We adapted a scale from Hübner, so you can see a couple of the items there. My life is going well, my life is just right, or reverse item, I would like a different kind of life. So those are our measures. Let's first of all just take a peek at what acculturation orientation these kids tended to adopt. And you can see, and Barry, I guess, would be quite pleased with this, that a goodly majority adopt the integration orientation. And we base this on midpoint splits of those 2 dimensions. There's a curious kind of decline here from time 1, where we've got nearly 90% of the kids adopting integration, it drops down to about 70%. I have no real inkling as to why, except that some of the qualitative data suggested to us that some of these kids were increasingly experiencing some discrimination at school. They got picked on a little bit because they had a funny accent, or they dressed in a slightly different way, or whatever. And you can see that the kind of corresponding with that is a slight increase in separation. I don't want to read too much into those changes. I don't really have an explanation for them. But I just wanted you to be aware, at least, that this sample were essentially an integrationist lot. They wanted to have lots of contact with the Chilean majority, but at the same time, they were proud of where they came from. They wanted to maintain the culinary, cultural, and other religious traditions. So the question is, how do these orientations map onto well-being, especially longitudinally? So here is a real bowl of spaghetti. This is the model that we tested. Roberto's laughing because he's very good at constructing spaghetti bowls. So we tested all these paths, but don't worry, it's going to get a bit simpler. Just want to point out a couple of things. So we wanted to control for age from the beginning. Age, it turns out, is negatively related to well-being. Remember, we're going from young kids up to teenagers, and teenagers tend to get a bit, not so happy. And say, is that right? Sometimes you see a decline in well-being with adolescents, so we control for that. But essentially, what we're going to do is look at the two dimensions here. You can see I've got culture adoption. I won't be overloading you with those data as well, so I'm just going to focus on desire for contact. And this is the critical one here, we also feed in the interaction term. And the interaction term, we believe, is one way, maybe not the only way, but one way to test the integration hypothesis, because then you can see whether does the combination of high desire for contact and high culture maintenance have any longitudinal consequences. And here, of course, are the DVs. And I'm just going to focus on life satisfaction. We've got some similar findings for self-esteem. OK, so what we get, so you can see I've instantly got rid of half the paths. And in some ways, a bit disappointing. Notice here are those two age effects that I pointed out. You see negative relationship between age and self-esteem, and age and life satisfaction. But the one path which is of interest is this one here. So you see this interaction term at time 1 is positively related to life satisfaction at time 2, and the reverse path is not significant. So there's no time 1 to time 2 relationship. So that's at least indicative that this relationship here, this interaction term, is positively related to life satisfaction. What does that interaction look like? Well, again, Barry's going to be very pleased because actually it rather nicely confirms his hypothesis, or one of his hypotheses, that if you are high on both, this is optimal for well-being. So you've got desire for contact along the bottom, and you've got high culture maintenance and low culture maintenance, and you can see that it's these guys who are doing best. So if you're high on that and high on desire for contact, your well-being is going to be better, higher, and that's a longitudinal relationship which is not matched by any reciprocal relationship in the other direction, suggestive of unidirectional causality. Okay, so these are 150 immigrant kids to Chile. I now want to look at a similar size sample of refugees in Great Britain. We don't have as many refugees in Britain as you do here in Canada. I think our wonderful government is committed to taking 5,000 refugees over the next 5 years. What an amazingly noble gesture. We, however, were able to find a sample of refugees, and these are resettled refugees. They've been in Britain for several years, upwards of 10 years, and these people will nearly always have been interviewed in a refugee camp in Kenya or Somalia or DRC, and by some random process been deemed worthy of being given refugee status, and so they're flown to Britain, and then they are resettled. And they're resettled all over the place, but we got access to these 4 cities So there are 4 local authorities who agreed to provide housing and other services for these refugees. There is another side to the project where we are interested in the comparison between these cities, but I won't go into that today. There's really not enough there, and there would be too much local contextual information needed to explain it. So, as you see, yeah, they arrived in 2010 or maybe a bit earlier. As I said, this is a multi-method, multidisciplinary project, so because I've got geographers and education people working on board with me, we're doing all sorts of stuff. We're doing focus groups. All our data, not collected by Amazon Turk, not by Qualtrics, face-to-face data collection. Every single data point here was collected with an interviewer, often a refugee, him or herself. We trained up some refugee research assistants, so it's part of the kind of capacity building aspect of the project. But also, it was just pragmatic from our point of view, much easier to get access to these communities by using refugees themselves. And we have a lot of research partners, as you can see, the local authorities in the 4 cities, a couple of NGOs, Refugee Action, Refugee Council, and the government, I have to say, were extraordinarily helpful as well. So, same again, we've got a 3-stage longitudinal design, much longer this time, so it goes over 2.5 years. So starting in January 2014 and just finished earlier this year in June. The attrition is not bad. We've got 64% participating at all 3 times, and if you knew anything about collecting data in this field, you lose a lot of people. They move, or they don't want to be interviewed a second time or a third time. But anyway, we've got about 2/3 of them in the sample at all 3 time points. You can see some details about the sample there. They come from all over, but particularly Ethiopia, Iraq, Congo, and Somalia. Right, well, just to give you, again, a little snapshot of 3 of the measures I'm going to focus on, and we collected, believe you me, dozens of different things, and there's Linda worrying about 100, what did you have, 80 items or something in your telephone? We've got about 250. So we've got all sorts of stuff, how much employment, education, job satisfaction, but here are the 3 measures of interest. We've got well-being, measured mainly from the PANAS scale. We measure their actual contact with British people, with those 2 items there. And we also are interested, obviously, in how much contact they have with their own community, which is perhaps important. You should see here language ability. Now, this is the one weakness, I think, of the study. We agonized over this. We wondered about whether to give them an actual objective test of English language competence, but it was so difficult to collect the data in any way, and to administer a 15-20-minute objective test was really going to be impossible. So we've just gone with their own self-rated competence in English. There is some data to suggest that self-ratings are correlated with objective measures, but that's all we can do. So if you want to shoot me down for that, you'll have to do that, because that's the one weak measure, I would say. Okay, so first of all, what kind of well-being do these refugees have? Well, as you can see, not so great. We've got, on one of our measures, we use a standardized measure, and we've got some UK data here, and we've got some EU average data. And you can see, let's just take a look at this one, satisfaction with life. Scoring 7 or 10 out of higher, 44% of our sample, compared with sort of 70% or more in the rest of Britain or in the EU. And similar on these other questions here. So not surprisingly, because these people have come from very difficult circumstances, often they escaped from torture and war and God knows what, and when they come to Britain, it's hardly a garden of roses either. So, there are some challenges there. The next thing I want to show you is the importance of language. I mentioned that language is related to a whole bunch of psychosocial outcomes, and you can see here, these are just positive, cross-sectional positive correlations between self-rated language proficiency and anything you like. Self-efficacy, health, cultural understanding, positive contact, so a little interesting point there, it's a cross-sectional correlation, but language proficiency is the one single measure in our thing which is just correlated with everything, which was kind of reassuring, and as you'll see, it then does play a critical role. Okay, so now let's go back to my original question. Is there a relationship between contact and well-being? Well, cross-sectionally, if we just look at time one, we've got the biggest sample there. We've got over 200 refugees here. And actually here we get an interesting relationship, and it's a kind of another berry-type relationship because we've got an interaction between majority contact. So this is high and low with British people. And here we've got contact with their own heritage community. And you can see again, the people who have the highest well-being are these people here, so are high on both. They are high, they have more contact than average with British people, and they seem to have more contact with their own community. So you can that's kind of like the integration option as well. However, of course, that's just a cross-sectional correlation, and when we look at the longitudinal relationship, then the picture changes a bit. So here is the first longitudinal path model I want to show you. We haven't got language in here at the moment. This is just contact and well-being, and you see we put in all the cross-lag paths so that we can tease out some of the causal directions. And look at this. So contact at time one is positively related with well-being at time two. Contact at time two is positively related to well-being at time three. And these opposite paths are not reliable. So that's suggestive that indeed intergroup contact is predictive of well-being. The more British people these refugees knew, the better they felt about themselves 1 year or 2 years later. But obviously, you're not going to be surprised when I put language into the picture. It gets a bit more complicated now. So we're putting language at all 3 time points. And now let's see what happens. Language at time one is positively related to contact at time two, and then we get the well-being relationship here. However, contact at time one is not related to language at time two. So this is suggesting that language is actually the key here. Language is what promotes more intergroup contact, and more intergroup contact then feeds through into higher job satisfaction. So for me, a rather nice finding, and there's a good policy implication for this, which I'll explain in a moment, because it does suggest that this is an absolutely key variable. As you can see here from this 62-year-old Aroma man, who really, I think, albeit in somewhat fractured English, he does capture exactly why English language is and was so important for him. And particularly, you can see down at the bottom here, he says, I have a barrier with all of them. It makes me less communication because of the language, my language barrier. If I had good language, I can make friends, even with British people, and it can make my life easier. And that's just but one of many other quotes I could have shown you. So what does this mean in policy terms? Well, as I said, I think competence in the language, in the majority language, is a key variable. It's a key which opens many doors, presumably to education, to employment, and as we've just seen, to providing you opportunities for contact with the majority, so-called bridging capital. Intergroup contact is important too, and both contact itself and the desire for such contact, I put causally, I'm always cautious, I know it's only a correlational design, but there is some evidence that it's unidirectionally related to well-being. And so one obvious implication of this is that if you are seeking to resettle refugees, you should certainly do it in such a way as to maximize the opportunities for contact with the host majority and not simply put them all in some refugee ghetto somewhere. Not that I'm advocating absolute kind of mixing. I think it's very important that they do have opportunities to have contact with their own community. As you can see, remember that one cross-sectional finding, so-called bonding capital. It's important that they do have contact with their own heritage culture, their own community. But the key thing, and I think the government is particularly taking this on board, that they should avoid plonking these refugees down in the middle of nowhere, far from other members of the host majority. And another point to note here, and of course it's tricky because often the local authorities will want to put them in the cheapest housing, often areas which are pretty high in deprivation, and we have a strong suspicion that that's not such a great idea either, because such environments are likely to maximize the opportunities for negative contact, and Stefania will tell you that negative contact is not such a great thing for well-being. So I think I will stop at that point.